Hello, it's Erlend from Way to Norway, and today I'm going to discuss what is called the input-based approach. And it's a very famous concept in language learning, or in any learning, to be fair. You might have heard of it under different names. For example, in Japan, it's known as tadoku, which means to read a lot and listen a lot. And that is the core idea. The idea to immerse yourself in the language through extensive listening and reading. So I'm going to go over to 5 points. I'm going to go over why I believe this approach, the input-based approach, is the best way to learn a language, or in our case, Norwegian. So number one is that it works. It's been proven. Many successful language learners and polyglots, people who speak many languages, they swear by this method. And by immersing yourself in Norwegian content, you naturally pick up vocabulary, grammar patterns, pronunciation, all these aspects of a language without the need of memorization or writing down grammar tables or all this sort of what I often call studying. You study by engaging and spending time with the language. And in my experience, focusing on input has significantly accelerated my comprehension and speaking abilities in my languages. And that is the experience of the students I have. And again, that's how I work with my students. When we first start, depending on their level, of course, we dedicate most of our time. Number one, I tell them you have to read and listen a lot passively throughout the week. And then when we meet together, have our lessons, we go through and break down, but that's with a tutor. We'll come back to that. Number two is that it's convenient and it's very easy. What I'm referring to when I say that, it being convenient and easy, is that you can practice anywhere. You can listen to things, podcast, YouTube videos, audiobooks, you name it, while you are doing other things. You can, for example, be in the car, you could be making food or doing dishes, you can be exercising, or even just relaxing at home. And a quite fantastic thing, as you probably know, of course, is that with the technology of today, where everyone has a iPod, I'm sorry, an iPhone, a smartphone available where they can download, they can get podcasts, audiobooks, ebooks when it comes to reading, but I'm thinking more of audio right now. And it's there, it's available. You don't need to schedule classes, you don't need to get on a bus to get to a course on that Tuesday evening or whatever silly prerequisite thing you need. You can access it whenever and however you would like. And for example, I very often recommend the students to, instead of thinking I have to carve out X time of the day and I have to physically sit down at a desk and study, I more often tell my students to focus on weaving bleeding Norwegian into your everyday. For example, if you take the bus for a total of 1 hour every day to work and home from work, that's an hour where you can listen to something, right? And by accumulating those things over time, weeks, months, years, you will supercharge your learning. Number three, there's no pressure to produce language. This is a very particular point, especially when it comes to people who, for different reasons, have a uh, more tight schedule in terms of having set levels they have to reach by a certain date. But with the input-based approach, it sort of removes the pressure of making mistakes in the early stages. Naturally, a lot of people feel anxious about speaking a new language because they fear that making mistakes, whether they are choice of words, grammatical mistakes, whatever you can find, is a negative, and that they feel embarrassed, which is, of course, natural, but it's a silly idea that I recommend that you try as much as possible to get out. of your head. With input-based learning, you can take your time to get comfortable with the language before you start speaking. There's tons of research that shows that the best way to practice your speaking, and with a language like Norwegian, which is quite a small language on an international scale, if you don't have access to someone to talk to, there's quite a lot of research that proves or shows that people who listen to other people talk, you practice speaking in a sort of way by listening to other people have conversations. Podcasts are great for this. And by listening, you take your time to get comfortable with the language, the sounds, the rhythm, the flow, the speed, and all these different things, different voices, different, in the case of Norwegian, different dialects, these things. And the misunderstandings during listening and reading are very often not as, you don't notice them in the same way. And of course, they're a part of the learning process that will diminish over time. Number 4 is that what's nice about input-based approach for learning is that you decide what you want to do, which makes it interesting and customizable. For example, if you are into, modern literature, news, music, TV shows like Scum or Nobel, just to mention something, you can tailor your learning to your interests by using these resources. This makes the process of learning much more enjoyable, and it keeps you motivated to continue, which is something I talked about before. If you're a fan of literature, if you like reading for the sake of reading, you should try reading books by famous Norwegian authors. Jo Nesbø is a very famous, internationally famous author. Jostein Gaarder, all these different things you can get into. And my point is there's no such thing as a bad resource. Try to remove that idea from your head. The only thing that makes something bad is if you don't find it interesting or engaging. Very often with my students, we talk a lot about, I, as a tutor, need to know if you're switched on or not, in the sense of this is actually sort of interesting. Of course, you have to go through certain things that you need, but very, very often you touch on those subjects or those topics or those grammar things or whatever it is over time by spending time with something that you find interesting. The last one, and number 5, is that the input-based approach is very cost-effective. It's cheaper. Sometimes it's free. Very often it's free as well. You don't have to invest in expensive courses. Getting a tutor, the tutoring classes I offer cost quite a lot of money, and therefore it's for the most motivated students. Or textbooks, grammar or language instruction books, whatever it is. There are tons of free resources available online, website, YouTube channels, podcasts, all these things. And libraries, if you're in Norway, they have Norwegian materials or material which is written in Norwegian, whether it be books, whatever it is. And that's the point of the resources I provide, is to give you access to very basic things that you can repeat a lot. And you should also not underestimate the value of social media today. Try as much as possible, again, going back to the point of, instead of carving out time, I'm bleeding Norwegian into my already established schedule and life and habits. If you start following Norwegian accounts on Instagram or whatever you use, you will then, by naturally spending time on these things, be shown Norwegian material, which is very, very, a hack in terms of, rather than sitting down and studying, you have Norwegian available everywhere, no matter where you look, so you can't sort of escape it. The last thing I want to mention is that even if you're taking classes or have a tutor, you have to focus on the input outside of the classroom. The classrooms, they provide structure and feedback, but they very often can't offer the same level, unless you do one-to-one tutoring with me, for example. They can't offer the same level of personalized, immersive exposure to the language as you might do by, reading a book you actually like, rather than I'm telling you we have to go through this family going to the store or whatever. So to summarize here is that you don't have to stress about speaking perfectly from day one. You don't have to worry about doing all these grammar exercises. You should immerse yourself in Norwegian through listening and reading and allow yourself to naturally, over time, absorb the language, and it will happen. Trust me. And language learning is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You can't. There's no way you can learn Norwegian in a week. It's up, or any language. It's impossible. You need to give yourself time, and you need to just stick to it. And by making that marathon, that process enjoyable, and using the interest you already have, you're much more likely to stick with it, and you're much more likely to see actual progress because you're engaged. So that's it. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.